So what do you anticipate with your, I mean, obviously you're you're like a Middle Eastern specialist.
I guess
not that you couldn't chit chat about China and Venezuela, because I'm sure you could, but so what do you foresee now happens? Let's talk specifically Israel with Biden coming in, because like obviously I was opposed to moving the embassy to Jerusalem. That is something that even, Obama wouldn't have even done. So like where do they go now if we bring in a more moderate Republican, or he is a Republican, a moderate Republic here.
Right. So I think what you're going to see is kind of like a maintaining of the status quo in Israel, Palestine. I don't think much is going to change. I think what you're going to see, the main policy that the Biden administration tries to change in the Middle East be related to the Iran nuclear deal. Biden and the people that he's hired to run his cabinet in the foreign policy realm were deeply involved in negotiating the nuclear deal under Obama. And it was like their one big achievement. And they were really pissed off when Trump came in and ripped it up because it like actually meant something to them. And just in terms of like the amount of energy they put into it, and they saw it as this huge foreign policy achievement.
Actually, that's one of the few things I'm looking for. Look, the Iran deal and the Paris Climate Agreement were pathetic, both of them, but yet I long to be back in them.
Oh, it's definitely like a better place for the world to be in than not to be in those deals, because the only other option with Iran is basically a road to war without the nuclear deal. And Iran, of course, wants the lifting of these draconian maximum pressure sanctions. So I think you're going to see the Biden administration really focused on trying to return to the Iran nuclear deal. Good. That, of course, does involve the Israelis, because the Israelis are so adamantly against that. I mean, the Israelis played such a huge role in helping craft, their interests inside the Trump administration through Jared Kushner and Mike Pompeo. And so they're not going to have that anymore. They're not going to have like a Likud-friendly policy in the Biden administration that is as antagonistic towards the Iranians. So I think that'll be like a positive development for the Middle East, is less likely a war with Iran. Yeah. That said, it's not guaranteed that they'll return to the nuclear deal. The Biden administration could try to like do this whole, well, first we're going to wait for some concessions from Iran before we lift sanctions and go back to the deal. That's totally possible that they'll do that. But I mean, so we have to keep our eye on that. But as for the rest of the region, I think it's going to kind of be the same. The other positive development you might see is less U.S. involvement and support for the Saudi war in Yemen. Because the U.S. mostly because the U.S. doesn't have much to gain from that. It's really like a Saudi interest.
But their interests are our interests, and that's
in this case, I mean, the interests lie in weapon sales.
Yeah,
that's pretty much
that's huge. That's a huge interest. I mean, look, Trump even had the chart. Remember when he pulled up he actually had pictures of the different airplanes.
He was like, look at all. Yeah, exactly. But that said, I mean, the U.S. has other avenues for weapon sales. I mean, the fear mongering around China is related to basically procuring. You need an enemy. You need an enemy to justify this massive budget. You need an enemy to justify these ongoing weapons purchases. And so you have a new boogeyman. I mean, the last couple of years, you even saw it in the Pentagon's own like layout of what its future goals are. Yeah. And it's all about great power competition. They've moved beyond the war on terror. They're sort of past that, though it's still playing out, in some parts of the world. But in the future, what they're looking towards is great power competition. That means between the U.S. and Russia, and more so the U.S. and China. And so I think we're going to see a really big shift. You already saw that pivot take place. I mean, the majority of the U.S. naval installations now are in Asia. Yeah. And that's because of this, this ongoing, this growing Cold War with China. So I think you're going to see a decrease in U.S. interest in the Middle East, not completely, but a little bit. I think things with Syria are going to stay the same. Syria is going to, continue to be strangled with sanctions. And it's just going to kind of be like going back to the Obama era in the Middle East with maybe slightly less intervention. Because where else is the U.S. going to intervene at this point?
We're running out of places. We're running out of places. I look at it. It's just sometimes I feel like I'm watching a train wreck in slow motion, and I'm like, this is just unbelievable. We just cannot leave people alone. We cannot leave people alone. And I love when we do the fear mongering regarding Russia. That's one of my favorites because, and I'll always question somebody, and I always say, okay, so let's say all of what you're saying is true. They got in there. They got in our election. They rigged it. They did it. What's their end game? Because if you look at the kind of people that they're supporting, it's people that want to leave them alone. All they want us leave them alone. We have close to 1,000 military bases. They have 8. Mm-hmm. They have an economy the size of Spain. What are we worried about? So like I say to people, do you think like Putin and the Russians are going to come up on the shores with their guns? Like, they're first of all, they're not even communist anymore. So I don't know what you think they're trying to do. Like, I'm so fascinated. So then I break it down to, look, oligarchs are oligarchs. I don't care if they speak Russian, Chinese, or English. It doesn't matter to me. They're not on my team.
They're only oligarchs if they're in Russia, though. They're never called oligarchs if they're in the U.S.
Wow. But it's the same difference to me. I don't care. I don't speak, it doesn't matter to me what language they speak. Right. They're working against regular people. And so that's the thing. So they could keep trying to make the Chinese and the Russians enemies. And I'm going to sit here and keep like laughing at that, because at this point, from a power perspective, nobody comes close. No. Nobody even comes close. Like, it's so ridiculous, disproportionate.
The Chinese have a potential economically to be they're an economic powerhouse, and that's what the U.S. is scared of with China. But it's interesting because one of the biggest fears when it comes to China is China's investments around the world. China does this thing where it invests in countries, it builds infrastructure. Obviously, it benefits from that, but the China has a relationship with other countries that isn't like what the U.S. does. The U.S. does this thing where it goes around the world and it basically says, like, if you don't exist in the way that we want you to exist, that only benefits us, and that is the kind of system that we want in place, we'll punish you. Yeah. If you don't want to be punished, you have to be this neoliberal system. China doesn't give a shit. China's like, you can be capitalist, you can be socialist, whatever you want. Doesn't matter to us, but like, we'll work with you to try and build like a port. Yeah. And so
because they're economically smart, and they're not being all like, it's not an ideological war for them. And they don't have to be like the righteous saviors of the universe. They're just making smart business decisions.
They're not an imperialist country. That's what the difference, right, between imperialism. And this is not to say China's amazing. People always take that to mean like I'm praising China. But like, no, it's like China, the US is an imperialist country that is like literally, it's an empire. It's trying to dominate the world. That's what empires do. China and Russia are just trying to exist in it. And I actually think it's a positive development for the world to have more than one superpower, because it's a check. Like, and people forget this, like, even as, obviously the Cold War was terrible because you had this like looming threat of nuclear apocalypse, but you also had something where like the US had something to compete with. So they had to give us the New Deal. They had to give us some welfare because they were competing with communists, like the communists of the Soviet Union. Yeah. And so like when there is some sort of like other country that exists, that's not just the US, like it's beneficial for the world in a lot of ways. That's one selfish way it's beneficial. Maybe we'll get more welfare in the US, but it's also beneficial in the sense that like you don't have this one dominating entity that doesn't have a check on it. And that's what the US is so upset about, is it's a weakened empire that can't go around and do whatever it wants as easily as it could 25 years ago. Like the US isn't going to be able to get like a coalition of the willing as easy as it could 25 years ago today, because China and Russia will veto it. China and Russia weren't vetoing the US war in Iraq, 20 years ago. Right. But today, after what happened in Iraq, after what happened in Libya, after what happened, and then the US, China and Russia literally prevented the US from collapsing Syria because of what happened in Iraq and Libya. Because they were like, enough. They vetoed every opportunity that the US tried to take at the UN Security Council to collapse the state of Syria. So I think in the long run, I think it's beneficial to actually have a multipolar world that has more than one superpower. And that's the big fight right now, because there's people who oppose that. They hear the word multipolar and they like freak out. There's like the sort of neoliberal mentality. They freak out.
And I'll tell you, the other thing is that we pulled out of the International Criminal Court. right?
Mhm.
So we have no accountability to any higher source in terms of what we do as far as war crimes, and people need to understand that. So my take on it is, until we get back into where we are accountable, we are a rogue state. And
Mhm.
people need to, we are the rogue nation that is going around and bullying the world. And I try to make that very clear. And yet I get called names. So